We have research that shows if you create a culture where people really feel like their generational and age experience is valued, being a younger person or an older person isn't a disadvantage, that becomes an advantage. You can be more innovative, solve problems, your performance goes up, you retain your people across generations. My approach is saying, how do we get there? How do we turn this from a threat to an opportunity? Let me give you some tools.
Megan, so glad you're here. LeaderPass podcast and LeaderPass Studios. We've loved having you.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. I've had a great time.
The team's had fun getting to know not just what your expertise is and what you're teaching, but also your style and your energy, which is awesome. Most people kind of cruise in here a little nervous. Were you nervous when you came, or were you okay?
I was not nervous. I love a microphone. It doesn't matter what microphone.
Okay, good.
It took me a little bit to get used to it, but
Yeah.
I love, I've done sort of versions of this for clients and things. And so I do really love the process of getting to kind of capture all the
Yeah.
things I love to talk about. And like I said, I love surrendering kind of the production process to the pros and just showing up and do what I do. So
Cool,
great.
man.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great having you. I want to talk about what you do.
Okay.
I want you to give us a little background, a little context, and then let's jump into your expertise because I think it's fascinating and people will be excited about it.
Yeah. So I am a leadership professor. I have worked at Miami University for just about almost 23 years, so a long time. And for the last 15 or so, I've really focused on how to help people lead across different generations.
Okay.
So we're in a 5-generation workforce for the first time ever, which is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard. And that comes with opportunities and challenges. And kind of the origin story is I started my career in academia at a time when I was pretty young for an academic, and ended up working with amazing colleagues, older colleagues, some of which were 40 or 50 years older than me when I started. But then had students that were like 4, 5 years younger than me.
Wow.
And I'm just a curious person by nature, and I teach leadership. I teach change management. I teach motivation. And the differences I was seeing in just 5 years between myself and my students were really fascinating to me. And rather than entering into it with what I've learned is kind of our default, which is judgment, like what's wrong with these kids? Or even on the other side, the okay boomer sort of mentality. I just found I'm fascinated by human behavior. I'm an organizational psychologist, is what my doctoral degree is, in organizational behavior. I thought, what is going on? Where's this coming from? Why are we seeing these changes? So I had to ask a lot of questions.
Okay.
And I really feel like that curiosity taught me so much, not just about where the differences were coming from, but literally taught me so much, right? The students were seeing things in new ways. They had new ideas, new kinds of expertise or information, not to mention 40 to 50 years of expertise in the other direction.
Yeah.
And I thought, what a gift. Here I am, a Gen Xer in the middle of all this. Like, bring it on. I want all of the perspective and information. And as I went on, I started researching that and realized like what we were giving people in terms of that was so rudimentary. We were sort of giving people the infographic of like, here's your generation, here's the years you were born, here's 3 things that happened to everyone in your generation, and here's how you all behave. And like, no one thinks that that's correct. That's like the most lazy way to think about a generation. And everyone would look at that when I would, be at a training, or I would be reading something, and they'd be like, oh, this is dumb. It seemed very pop psychology, like
Yeah,
not based on anything, and people would disengage. And I thought this has nothing to do with all the expertise and best practices and how to manage difference, diversity, cross-cultural management. We know all these great things in academia about best practices, and none of them are being applied to this kind of difference. Why? So that was kind of the big origin story, the spark for me. I thought, we can do much better than this. And I am fascinated and I've learned so much. And then when went out and saw that so many professionals were not having a positive experience. I lucked into this positive experience. That became the mission of my work, is like, how do I help other leaders, other organizations have that positive intergenerational experience I had that really made me better at my job? And so that's what, I call all my work Gentelligence. We need to be smarter about generational differences, and that's really just what sparked all of it.
That's awesome. And that was roughly 20 years ago, or was that
Yeah,
sooner than that? Because I
I
know
would
your TEDx or your TED Talk was in 2017, I
It
think.
was.
Yeah.
So I would say, my lived experience, sort of my initial positive experience happened probably the first 5 years of my career, which would have
Okay.
been 15 to 20 years ago. And then maybe like the awakening that this wasn't a very common generational experience for people to have at work started to come from that. I started doing speaking, I started doing research. And so my voice on that, I think, stood out because I wasn't putting up the infographics and the tired cookie cutter lazy slides. I actually call that out pretty directly and say, of course, no one's interested in hearing this, because you don't look at that and go, yes, that's me and 70 million other people my age. It seems very simplistic.
Yeah.
And so calling that out and saying, how do we walk a line and not stereotype people based on their generation, but acknowledge that generational differences at work are very real. And for me, you can walk that line by really thinking about, where do generational norms come from? What does it mean to grow up and start your career in a particular time in history? And how does that shape not every person in your generation or not everyone universally, but how does it lead to these super interesting norms that kind of ebb and
Hmm.
flow
Hmm.
over time that we see and we come up against and go, well, that's different. What's going on there? Why are my younger colleagues saying or doing this versus what I would have done at their age? And so, I think my voice started to become recognized from that different approach,
Okay.
and that willingness to push back. And then I did the TEDx in 2017. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to capture my approach. And it really was taking what we know about the best way to manage difference and applying it to a topic that for some reason we hadn't ever brought those two ideas together
Hmm.
before, generations and best practices in managing difference. And so in 2021, we published our book. So I co wrote that with two former students of mine. So there's kind of a full circle moment.
Okay.
You can't write a book about generational diversity and the power of generational differences by yourself. Like, that would be hypocritical,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
And they're both millennials. So we wrote that together, led to our Harvard Business Review article a year later. And then that was chosen as a must read for 2024. And that, of course, has just, the whole thing has exploded.
What would you say your different approach is? So let's talk about that approach, or Gentelligence approach in general.
Yeah, I get very prickly when I hear or read things where people say, all Gen Xers want this, and all millennials want that, and all Gen Zs are this way, because that's wrong, right? You're taking, again, 70 million people and you're boiling them down to this caricature, and immediately you're wrong about that. And so I will start out and ask people when I do a keynote, I'll say, how many people are waiting for those slides? Right. And like, people laugh and half the room puts their hand up. And I say, I'm so sorry to disappoint you. That's not what I'm going to do. So I actually think that's what's wrong with this and why we haven't made more progress on this topic. Because when we were researching the book, we found quotes from, Socrates that said, like, what's wrong with these kids? Like, they're never going to make it. Like, it is literally an age old pattern
Yeah.
that every generation that moves into the workplace pushes on norms and brings in their own point of view, and we don't like it, and what's wrong with them, and it happens to all of us. And then as we age, we forget, right? And so we get really locked into our own norms. So my approach, I say, I'm never going to give you a script. I'm never going to tell you who you are because of the year you were born. I really encourage people to learn tools to have smarter intergenerational conversations. I'm not an expert at what you do, so I can't tell you what that conversation
How to apply
exactly
it.
should
Yeah,
be.
exactly.
But I can give you tools so the next time you encounter something, I always say, when you want to say, are you kidding me right now? It is time for Gentelligence. That is your moment. That is your signal. And then we give people power questions. We have a toolbox, things that are really like, okay, how do I enter into this in a different way so that the result is something constructive, right? Because the thing that's magical about this topic is, just left alone, your generational workforce is not going to be successful. It's going to be frustrating, which is what most people have experienced. We have research that shows if you manage and lead it well and you create a culture where people really feel like their generational and age experience is valued,
Mhm.
and being a younger person or an older person isn't a disadvantage, and in, best case it's an advantage to have a different perspective. You can reverse that, and your age diverse workforce or your generationally, diverse workforce becomes an advantage. You can
Mhm.
be more innovative, solve problems, your performance goes up, you retain your people across generations. And so it's really like the linchpin. So my approach is saying, how do we get there? How do we turn this from a threat to an opportunity? Let me give you some tools.
And the tools could be power questions. It could be moments of discussion that. So here's what I hear you saying. I don't hear you saying you don't need to understand that generation's context because you need to be aware of it. But that's not the method that you're saying works. Just knowing, or generalizing, I should say.
Right. I
Yeah.
think there's a line between, be curious, not judgmental is one of the mantras that we pull on. I think we should be incredibly interested in the why. So instead of sort of like, saying, well, you're a Gen Xer, therefore you're this, it's like, oh, I'm seeing a lot of people in this age group who are looking at their career this way. That's kind of a norm. Not everybody, but sort of that's a, what's a higher frequency? Like people in my age group were more likely to think this way or do this way than my parents or my kids. Why? Right? And the why, and I spend, when I do a talk, I'll spend the first 20, 25 minutes on walking people through the why. Like one of the things I love to talk about is like, where did our norms for success come from generationally? Right? What were people pointing to and saying, like, you get this, you'll have made it.
Hmm.
Right. And for baby boomers, maybe it was the corner office. Not every baby boomer. Again, we got to be careful. But there's a generation that really, being a workaholic was sort of like a cultural badge of honor.
Yeah.
For my generation, Gen X, having more balance and pursuing your personal independent passions was like, that's cool, right? And so that's interesting. Like, why? Where did that come from? And I think helping people build in that pause. And one of our power questions is, can you help me understand?
Hmm.
Keeps you from jumping to judgment that, well, I wouldn't do it that way. It's wrong, to, oh, that's fascinating.
Hmm.
And maybe the best metaphor, I love metaphors, but one of the best metaphors we've had is like, if you think about generations as a type of culture, you want to have the same mindset you would have when you travel, right? Like if you go to Italy and you sit down and you order a meal, you learn really quickly that they're not bringing you that check until you ask for it, because in their cultural norm is it's your table to enjoy. They take their food very seriously. They take hospitality very seriously. But as an American, if I don't realize that and I'm sitting around waiting for my check, I could easily be like, well, this is rude. Nobody's come
Like it's
over
bad
to give me
service.
my
Yeah.
check.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when we start traveling out of our bubbles, that like, oh, that's a cultural difference. How fascinating. When I go to Italy, I'll be sure to ask for my check when I'm ready, because they do that a little different here. So we say, like, you don't say what's wrong with these people. You say, oh, fascinating. And that's the curiosity. If we could bring that into our intergenerational
Hmm.
dynamics, how much better off would we be? Because you travel because it is interesting.
Hmm.
So every workplace has that potential to be that interesting if you
Hmm.
bring that
So you're
mindset.
taking that cultural example and you're applying it to generational,
Yeah.
experiences, or, so then are you supplying questions for people to kind of probe and to find out in
We
a
are,
non-threatening way,
yeah.
I should
So
say? Yeah.
our leader pass, we give, two sample questions for we have four practices, but then in the workbook, we have all of them. We have over 20. So we collect them and I use them myself. A lot of them come from my own, I'll scribble, oh, that one worked really well. And and they work older to younger, but also younger to older, right? They're
Okay.
not age specific.
Okay.
They're just simply meant for you to really develop, whether it's curiosity or encourage people to share a perspective that's not yours,
Hmm.
right? That I don't want to shut down someone who wants to share a different perspective. One of my most, sort of profound early career experiences when I did start is I had an older colleague say, this is not a place where you need to hold back because you just got here or you're a younger person. Like, we hired you in part because we
So
want
they
to hear what you
encouraged. Oh, that's
think.
cool. Yeah.
And I'm sure they're sorry they said that, 22
You're
years
like,
ago.
give me the
They're
mic.
like,
Give me
who
the
told
mic.
her
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
wanted to hear? But, I think some of the power questions are just simply pausing. If you think of one of our power questions is like, how would you approach this? So, like, example I give is like, we're all trying to figure out AI, what role do we want it to play? Where are the guardrails for our organization? So, even with my students, I'll say the first day of class, like, we got to develop an AI policy in the classroom. Really interested in how you would approach that. If that was up to you, what would you have as a policy? Now, it's not that they get to make the policy, but if we co-create it,
Hmm.
I'll say, how is it helping you learn? Where is it backfired for you? What should I be worried about? And then, you know, uh, I learned so much. One, I learned things that I didn't know AI could do because they're using it for things I'm not using it for. I learned from them. I had somebody say, "Well, I put all my work through there to ask if there's a bias I wasn't aware of." Like, what educator wouldn't want a student to be more aware of a bias?
Hmm.
But then, Gentelligence is about me saying, "Well, that's fascinating. Like, can I share my perspective?" And the answer, if you've already asked somebody to share theirs, is always yes.
Yeah.
They're like, "Oh, yeah, like,
Yeah.
let me hear you now." And so that's how intergenerational learning transfers.
Very collaborative on that
It's very
approach. Yeah.
collaborative, and I think what I hear from a lot of younger employees is, it's not that I don't respect that person, but every time they talk to me, I feel like I'm getting a lecture that is so disconnected from the world I am living in.
Hmm.
And what happens then is we're losing all that expertise because people are kind of, putting hands over their ears. And a lot of it is still very relevant. But if I give you advice based on my life experience after asking for your sort of point of view, then I'm going to be able to connect it. Like, oh, I love that idea, Jamie. Like, I do have a couple questions. Like, do you think we're going to have a budget issue? Like, that's a thing Megan had to learn that maybe the 22-year-old hasn't yet had to learn.
Yeah.
But I'm asking in service of helping
You're
improve.
not attacking. Yeah,
Right, I'm not
absolutely.
lecturing, I'm helping to sort of mentor, and it works the other way too for a younger person to say, "How would you approach this?" You're
Mhm.
asking for advice and you're partnering, you're not, competing or tug of war of I know better than you, your way, my way.
How do you, so I'm tracking and that's super cool. So I'm picturing leadership at a company or managers at a company who now have this new generation coming in, just to speak to the larger contrast. Is this primarily the responsibility of the leader in the company to learn these power questions or to learn how to foster that? Or are you trying to also equip the new workforce, the new employee in that case?
Yeah, I think all of the above.
Okay.
It's a slightly different angle because when we talk about older people leading younger people or greeting the next generation that's coming into the workforce, there's a lot of role modeling that goes on, right? If we know the culture we establish is what the linchpin is about whether this helps you or hurts you, obviously leadership has a huge part to play in that.
Right.
And in the LeaderPass, we talk about how do you build it into your HR strategies and your team building and your, all of those things. But I always say to leaders, our responsibility is to realize that we've built this house, and the young people, whether it's Gen Z or next will be Gen Alpha, they're going to come and shake the walls of your house. That's what young people do. We all did it, right? Maybe we don't remember we did it, but we did it. And that's okay. Like, we need to not get defensive and, think that somehow we're being attacked. It's a curiosity that's maybe coming in a very raw way. And if they shake a wall, that's what I call a load bearing wall. Like, hey, this is really core to who we are, our industry or our organization. It's our values, it's our tradition. That's when you stop and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're interested. Let's go grab a coffee and talk about why we do it that way here." Because it's
Mhm.
actually a really interesting story. That's role modeling that you're allowed to ask questions, but we're not, and we're also allowed to hold firm on some things that we do really stand behind. But some of the walls that young people push on are those decorative 90s half walls, you know what I mean? Because you're like,
Yeah.
you were
Yeah.
around then too.
Yep.
But there are things we built in our organization that served a purpose at the time. And we sort of become blind to them or used to them. And we're walking around this half wall until somebody new comes in the house and goes, "Why is there a wall sticking out there? Like, that's really inconvenient, or that doesn't make sense anymore." And part of it is dialing down the defensiveness and being willing to acknowledge that not all walls are load bearing walls. And some of them probably do need to be looked at again. And maybe
Mhm.
that's not serving us anymore. And then when you say, "Oh, Well, that's a really great question. Let's sit down together and talk about that. I'm interested in why you feel that way. That's how you evolve and change. So, on the older end of things, it's really powerful. But then, per your question, because I do get to work with the youngest generation moving into the workforce during the, my daily work, it's also helping them understand that the norms they grew up with are likely different than the norms they're going to be walking into. And as a young person, you usually aren't very aware of that. You're
Right.
in kind of
Right.
your own age bubble. And for example, this idea of calling off for a mental health day, which is very common, and kudos to Gen Z for that increased awareness that they want to take care of their mental health. There's a whole why behind that, but many of my students weren't really aware that that wasn't a common practice, or that we haven't always done that.
Okay.
So it's not that they shouldn't, but know your audience, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to tell your boss, who maybe grew up learning that's a personal issue, not a workplace
Yeah. Don't bring
issue,
it in here.
that you need
Yeah.
a mental health day, might not land maybe this way you're expecting. And you can choose any workplace topic. And so a curiosity, right? Kind of figuring out, what things around here am I seeing that seem different to me, and where do they come from? Are they load bearing walls? Are these up for discussion? So it's for everyone, but
Yeah.
sometimes, the way you use the questions and the strategies will differ depending on your career
And it
stage.
identifies that. You do a lot of work with some very large companies. You and I met through a relationship with one of those that has franchises or has systems and things that you really do need to follow. So navigating that, can those power questions still support and serve managers who do have a reason why they're successful is because they do it a certain way. And then where do you encourage poking on those walls, and where do you like equip maybe a manager to say, hey, look, I welcome that, or I want to talk about that. Let me tell you why it's done this way. And sometimes it's just because that's the system that we have to follow. That's the job, or that's the word.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is I think we sometimes maybe mistake generational leadership as, well, we've got to do what the youngest generation wants because we don't want them to leave, or we've got to, and that's not really what it is. If you think about, as time goes on, our younger generations have grown up with unlimited access to information, and then even more importantly, explanation.
Mm,
And so whereas when I started my career, there were things that made no sense to me in my organization, but the norm wasn't that you pushed back or
no
even
question. Yeah.
asked,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because the answer would be, that's above your pay grade, or you don't need to worry about that.
Mm,
And even if it really didn't make sense, it was sort of like, well, maybe by the time I get to that level, I can do something about it, or it'll make sense to me. Younger generations who have grown up asking Google or Alexa, why is the sky blue? Why is this happening? Why does this, to then come to an organization where the information or the explanation is sort of, there's like a gatekeeper, right? It's behind the curtain. You don't get to know that. It creates trust issues. And that's where that word transparency gets thrown around a
yeah.
lot these
Yeah.
days. Like, I need more transparency. And older generations are like, no, you can't have that, because you just started. You don't get to have that. I didn't get to have that. But if you grew up with transparency, if we define it as just like, you can know why anytime, to suddenly be denied that creates like, what are they not telling me?
Hmm.
And if I always say, like, if you know the answer, like, well, corporate make sure this is standardized for the following reasons, there's no benefit in not sharing
Yeah.
that
And keeping that. No.
information.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a big misperception about young people, that they, if you tell them the why, in my experience, it goes such a long way. Even if they don't agree with it, or they think that's silly, the respect of explaining the why. I mean, these are smart people that can understand, like, okay, that's a standardized process that's come from somewhere, up the food chain, that we don't have control over. Interesting. Right. And I could say, well, this is how we've been told to do it. Here's actually why it's really great. Certainly everything could be improved, but yes, this is why we do that.
Hmm.
But then I think you also get a lot of bandwidth by being willing to think about which things we do around here aren't stuck in stone,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's this misperception that if I say, well, I don't know, do you think there's a better way to do it, that somehow I lose respect? I think that's a very,
Like
quote,
there's a
age
chink in the
old.
armor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
"Oh, well, she doesn't even." I have found the opposite to be true, right? Being willing to be like, "I don't know, does anyone have a better way to do that?" Like, I'll think like, I'm open to input. There's such power because now suddenly they've got skin in the game,
Yeah,
right? They're part of
yeah,
what's going on. They're not just doing what you tell them to do. And
yeah.
then there's accountability that comes with that. There's responsibility, and that's obviously how you get people to buy in.
To buy in. So think, just for fun, think of the all the questions you provide or the discussion kind of prompters. Uh, have you seen one or two, or you can just tell me one even that have been like, man, that's one of the better ones. And you may have already said it, but just what comes to mind if someone's watching this and they've got all five generations in their workforce? What's a question that you could say, man, this is you get a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna choose one. I love the "Can you help me understand?" question. That
Yeah,
one's
that's
gold.
a biggie. Yeah,
That works all the time. But I already talked about that one, so I'm gonna go with one we haven't talked about before. Is one of the things I didn't even realize was so prevalent and important when we wrote the book. But when I started working with clients and speaking, it became very clear. Our first intelligence of practice is identifying assumptions. And so the first part of that, of course, is bias, like check your biases around age. But the other part of assumptions that I just had a blind spot about is how often are we assuming that we're all seeing a concept, a term, a word, that we're defining it in the same way, when generationally we may have very different anchors or views
for
on
the
that.
definition of it. Okay.
Yeah. So I was called into a big healthcare organization to help them navigate some generational tension around transparency. So, a word I just used. Um, and I, I used a question that at the time wasn't identified as a power question, but it was for my own clarity. I started the session with, when I say transparency, what does that mean to you? And the older people on the call were the leadership, and they said, well, it means confidentiality. It means, like, these are the things locked in the inner sanctum that only some people have access to because of liability and legal reasons. And there were younger people on the call, and they said, well, that's not what we're talking about. Like, when we ask for transparency, we want to understand, why was that decision made? What was the context? Like,
Okay. Yeah.
why do we have this policy now? And immediately it was apparent that they had been having two very different conversations.
Because the vocabulary was different. Was a
Transparency,
different word.
right, is
Yeah.
a word we throw around a
Okay.
lot. And so immediately the older leadership said, oh, well, we could see providing more of that, maybe. But there's always that hurdle of like, well, nobody did that for us, that for older
100%.
leaders,
Yeah.
we have to coach them
I
through.
didn't get that. So why am I?
Like,
Yeah.
the begrudgment is not a leadership strategy, is
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
say. Like, but wouldn't it have been nice if somebody would have explained to you and taken you to coffee to tell you why you do that? That wasn't the norm then. That was of its time, as I like to say. But we can do better than that, right? I can explain it to you even if nobody explained it to me. We don't lose anything from that, right? And so I think the question, when I say blank, what does that mean to you? And I've had so many examples. So just a fun one maybe is, we hear headlines all the time like Gen Z doesn't, isn't no professionalism, or work ethic. Well, what does that mean? Those are terms that are subjective. So if we take professionalism, I was having this fascinating conversation with my son who's 19, my niece is 17, and we were having lunch, and I said, I got this funny question from a student a few weeks ago about where his phone goes on the table during like a business lunch. And they just looked at me like, why is that a funny question? I said, well, your phone isn't on the table during a business lunch. And they're like, why not? And I was like, because that's rude. They're like, why is that rude? Right. And it was like, oh, it, again, that's a younger person's
Yeah.
view,
Yeah.
but also, why is that rude? Right. And to us, it's like, well, you're distracted. You're not giving Jamie your full attention. That's not protocol. But who decides professionalism?
Mhm.
Who decided that you and I didn't have to show up in suits today?
Mhm.
Right? Who decided that it was okay to, bring your dog to work? Like, when did that become a thing that was sometimes okay to do? And I dug into it. I found some fascinating, Harvard Business Review did an article in the '80s. Like, you can think about old-timey professionalism, like, Jamie throws his coat down over the puddle for Megan as they walk down the street. Like, we know we've moved on from that, but in the '80s, the Q&A about professional etiquette in Harvard Business Review was like, um is it okay to turn down offers of hard drugs from clients at a company gathering? Like, that was something they
Wow.
were talking about. Like, the answer was
Yeah.
yes, in case
Yeah.
anyone
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
wondering.
Yeah.
Or like, what do we do about the unwed pregnant manager in our office? And today we'd be like, you do nothing because that's none of your
You shouldn't
business.
bring that up. Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
was like a professional etiquette question
Oh
in the
yeah.
80s. And so those things evolve.
Yeah.
But if we have five generations, we had a really long discussion at a meeting once about what someone wore to a job interview. This person had worn a short sleeve polo. It was a hot day. And one of the older people in my office was like, well, he doesn't really want this job. He didn't wear a suit.
Hmm.
It didn't phase me at all. I'm like, who'd wear a suit? It's like 90 degrees out. But his
During that
lens
time, yeah. I
with
mean,
his
I think
professionalism.
about it was in the '80s. I mean, this is funny, but it's like if you had a beard and you're a man, you weren't as trustworthy.
Right?
So you had to be clean shaven. If you're wearing a suit, blue, red tie, white shirt. And so bringing what you were told maybe at that time, that was the definition, to your point, of professionalism, or that's a way to be professional, not, or show up, Lombardi time, 15 minutes before your appointment.
If you're not early, you're late,
There you
right?
go.
That's what my
Yeah.
dad would say. And I do think, like, if we take something like flexibility, right? The $1 million word, like flexible workplaces. Flexibility is the number one benefit for every generation. That's what it was, a survey that just came out. Like, every generation lists flexibility as number
Mhm.
one, but what that means can be very different. If your whole career were in an office 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, anything that's not that is like, I have flexibility now.
Mhm.
If you started your career in 2020 or 2021 and you have a labradoodle and an airstream in the mountains, and now suddenly there's a mandate that you come into the office
Yeah.
three
Yeah.
days a week, that's just not enough flexibility. Like, that might not be your definition of flexible for a really valid reason. Like,
Yeah.
there's always a why. But if we're just talking about creating a more flexible workplace, have we stopped to ask, when I say flexible, what does that mean to you?
Mhm.
Right? And so I love that question because you can insert whatever word is
Oh, yeah.
relevant to you in there.
Killer. I mean, we could talk about that. I mean, I get ideas. I don't want to bring them up because we'll just keep on going because it's
I
fun.
know.
This is
Yeah.
fun because I feel like every time we do that, we're learning more about ourselves and
Yes.
also the
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
generations in there.
Absolutely.
No, that's awesome. So where do you see right now, where do you see things heading for you? And then I want to talk about where people can find you, your website. I know you've got your new LeaderPass coming out, which will make sure everybody has access to find that. But where do you see things in the next few years going?
Yeah, I'm excited. I've had to think a lot about this because I've been approached by, people, wanting to know, like, do we what's our plan, and do we want to merge things? We're having a really good time. Um, I think the topic just keeps getting more and more important. And so our platforms are getting bigger. And I really, my goal is to continue to spread the work, to be open to the, just like this, channels and different ways of doing it. I've got just a few coaches that I've certified, people that I know are amazing teachers, and really passionate about the topic, that are helping me go out and do the
Cool.
talks and the
Hmm.
work. So, I think I'm really focused on building the ability to bring the message to more people and bring the work to more people. I'm really interested in that. I'm working hard to try to bring the research along with it. So keeping my foot both on the academic and
It's a big
practitioner
deal. Yeah.
island and
Yeah.
letting
Yeah.
those kind of inform each other. And making sure the things we learn are getting to the people who need them. So, I think we want to continue the trajectory we're on in terms of putting out really smart work. I want to continue to be a voice that's saying, like, what people are thinking, but maybe don't always say out loud about, hey, we got to get better at this. This is not a challenge that's going away. Our global impact is growing. So I got the opportunity to speak in Australia. We've been to the UK. We've done some things in Italy, Canada. I had an opportunity to do some work with some ombudsman of the United Nations. And so there's just a lot of context where this matters. And I love learning how it shows up in different industries. So I think in terms of where we're going, it's really trying to help people frame this differently and getting that set of tools out to as many people as we can.
That's awesome. So they find you on LinkedIn. Where's the best
It's
place if they want to?
gentelligence.org.
Okay.
So we're the org, not the com.
Okay.
You can find us there. So all of the articles, the tools, the workshops, the web, our LeaderPass will be there hopefully soon. And then you can find me on LinkedIn. Our Gentelligence book you can get online. You can check out the Harvard Business Review article for kind of a snapshot on that. It's called Harnessing the Power of Age Diversity. And you can sign up if you sign up on our website. Give us your information. It actually automatically sends you the 20 power questions. So you can take a
That we've
look
been
at
talking about.
yourself
There
and
you go.
see what you think and get yourself started on
I think
that.
that's a great next step for people watching this, but absolutely. Well, we're excited that you're with LeaderPass, excited about working with you, and more to come, I'm sure. So thank you for being here and being on the show.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
All right. High five.